Good evening, everyone. It is so nice to see so many faces here. Faces I know, faces I haven't seen in a few years, faces that are new. I'm Celia Moore, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm the director of the Center for Responsible Leadership at Imperial College Business School. And when I was asked to direct the center, I had a history of research on leadership and a history of research on ethics, so I knew about those two topics, but I'd never actually studied responsibility. And it's a really interesting concept, actually. Most people, when they define responsibility, just define it with a synonym, which isn't that helpful. So they say things like, when you're accountable, or they say, you're responsible when you're responsible. Yeah, that's true. But the best definition I found is the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, who said that to be responsible is to be the uncontested author of an event or thing. And the slightly disappointing fact is that this is actually a really hard thing to do, and there are many more leadership positions than there are leaders who are willing to sit in them, able and willing to be the uncontested author of their actions and the consequences that follow them. This is suboptimal. So one of the things that we are aiming to do at the center is help build people's ability and self-efficacy to exercise their moral agency responsibly. And no better way I could do that than by hosting this inaugural Leadership Generations event. This event has been a long time coming, and I'm so excited to be able to introduce you to Mary and Jack. The idea behind the series is to get leaders from different stages of life and career to discuss a specific topic that is of relevance to leaders and leader effectiveness. Today's topic is leading without formal authority. The fundamental truth about leadership is that it can be exercised from anywhere. People think that they need power or status or a title or a position in a hierarchy or access to resources, but actually you don't. To be a leader, all you need is a goal that people are willing to enact with you collectively, which means that all of us in this room can start leading now, start leading tomorrow. Doesn't matter if you have a job or not, doesn't matter where you are in your career, doesn't matter how old you are. It just means that you need to come up with a goal that people want to join you in enacting. So let me introduce my two panelists for this evening. I'll sit down now, hopefully people can see me because I'm so short. So both of my panelists are incredibly impressive professionally, but that is not the specific reason why I invited them here today. So Mary Meany to my left has been at McKinsey, was at McKinsey for 25 years, including the last 10 as a senior partner. She has been on the board of the business school at Imperial here for 6 years and on college council for 2. But she's here today as a community leader who, since the first days after Russia invaded Ukraine, has worked tirelessly to support displaced Ukrainians. I just wanted to give you some numbers so you get a sense of the scope of these projects. This has involved recruiting, motivating, and leading over 300 volunteers who together have welcomed, fed, housed, given medical and psychological care, employed, and educated 500 Ukrainians, ranging in age from a few days old to 94 years. Jack Blazinski is a 2023, that is his name, I just didn't say it right, I'm sure. MBA grad that I had the privilege of teaching last year. He is currently vice president at Socii Capital, but he has had previous positions at Google, CrowdStrike, and IBM before that. That is not why he's here either. He is here today because he is a fundraiser extraordinaire who used his background as an Olympic-level swimmer and identity as the son and grandson of Ukrainian immigrants to marshal 5 swimmers and 12 crew to train 2 hours a day for many, many weeks to swim the English Channel in May, swimming 50,000 meters in 10 hours and 37 minutes, 14,000 of those meters himself in 2 hours, which together generated $250,000 US for Ukraine relief. So hopefully those numbers give you some sense of the scope and size of these two giant projects that these amazing humans took on, knowing that they would need an enormous amount of human capital, social capital, labor, and resources, and no clear game plan in either case. So there is no better examples of taking on a moral task without having the formal authority to do so. So how this is going to work, I'm going to ask each of them a few questions, and then after about 40 minutes, hopefully we'll open it up to questions. When we do that, we've got Juliana who will run around with a mic, and because we are recording this, please wait till you have the mic before you ask a question, or it will influence the recording. So thank you. Thank you guys for joining me. I want to begin by just asking, how do you possibly decide to take something like this on?
I can start off. I'll give you a little context about my family. I think that might be quite helpful. So Celia mentioned my grandfather was Ukrainian on my father's side. So he was born in Western Ukraine in 1920, early 1930s, and by 1940s, right, leading up to World War II, you've got an occupying Soviet force, invading Nazi force. Your choices as a Ukrainian citizen are either enlist in the Soviet army or be killed. So my grandfather was the youngest of 6, 3 older sisters, 2 older brothers. And what we were able to find out through my aunt who traveled back to Ukraine a few years ago was that his whole family was killed. All the women in his family were shot at home and the men sent to work camps, which essentially was a death sentence. My grandfather at 15 fled through Switzerland into Italy on a bicycle, found a refugee camp, and then made his way to the UK a few years later. Dad was born, I was born, the world goes on. And then this time last year, I guess early January of 2022, right, we hear the rumblings that, Russia's surrounding Ukraine, potential invasion. For me, I always knew I was Ukrainian, but it was never a big part of my identity for a long time, right? I didn't really resonate with it. And then I think when I started reading about the news, seeing what was happening in Mariupol with the initial invasion, I was like, excuse my language, I was like, holy shit, this is where I get my resilience from, right? Watching Ukrainian people. I was like, this is my heritage. And I just had a feeling of how do I stop my heritage from being eradicated? And that was February of 2022, and that was the day I decided, this is something I'm going to use my resources to work for.
It's an amazing story. Mine is a little bit different. I was actually watching the television, and for me it was completely inconceivable that we were going to see Russia invade Ukraine. And I remember looking at the television and watching the tanks rolling in and watching the bombs on maternity clinics and on theaters filled with civilians and thinking, how is this possible in 2022? How is this possible in Europe? How is this possible basically on my backyard? Right? And so the decision to do something was pretty easy. It was kind of born out of shock and revulsion and disgust. And how is this possible? And also a sense that I had to do something, right? We all had to do something.
Well, that is consistent with research that shows that people that take on giant moral tasks often describe them as not having any choice, right? Which is interesting because you did, right? And yet you decided to do this amazingly giant thing anyway. So what are the beginning steps, right? These are enormous projects. People get overwhelmed with considering an enormous project. How do you break it down so that it becomes less overwhelming to start leading something like this?
So my first steps were incredibly small. I wrote an email to my husband, who was on an archaeological excavation, saying, sweetheart, what do you think about the idea of hosting 1 or 2 families? To which he immediately responded, of course, no problem. So then I asked our kids, and I said, what do you think about it? Because obviously we were going to be sharing our house and our toys and the farm and everything. And they were all up for it. And so at the time, the French government, I live in northern France, the French government was asking for families who are willing to host Ukrainian displaced people. So I called up the town hall and I said, look, we have a big place, we have lots of room, we're very happy to take in a couple of families. And then the next day I called back and I talked to the same lady at the town hall and I said, okay, so where do I pick them up? And she's like, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, the Ukrainian displaced people, where do I pick them up? When are the trains arriving? When are the buses arriving? And she's like, I have no idea. And I said, well, planes? I mean, like, what's the plan? And she's like, I have no idea. And I said, well, does anybody have any idea? And she's like, I have no idea. And I thought, okay, well, I'm not going to get very far if I'm counting on this. So I was like, okay, fine. How hard is it to rent a bus? I can just rent a bus. So I call up the 5 local bus companies in our area, and I asked them if they'd give me a free bus with 2 drivers and the gas to go all the way to Poland and bring back, some women and children. And the first 4 bus companies basically say no flat out, right? The 5th one says, well, we can do it, but we're not going to do it for free. And I was like, okay, fine, just send me a quote. So they send me a quote. Turns out it's 15,000 euros, which I thought was kind of expensive for a bus. So I was like, okay, if it's really expensive to rent a bus in France to go to Poland, I'll just rent a bus in Poland to come to France. So that's what I did. And then we had a little bit of social media in our local community and so on. And then the next thing I know, I get this very official email from the lady at the town hall informing me that it is, of course, the French government in all its majesty that is going to be in charge of all of the transport and logistics and the housing and everything else related to every Ukrainian man, woman, and child who's going to be coming to France. So I immediately respond going, that is fantastic. When are your buses arriving? To which she responded, I have no idea. And so I then sent back a note saying, well, I'm in touch with this beautiful Ukrainian woman. Her name is Anna. She gave birth the day of the invasion. The day after she left hospital, she packed her bags, said goodbye to her husband and country, and made her way to the border. She's currently at Rava-Ruska. It is minus 6 degrees centigrade and a 20-hour crossing on foot with a newborn baby. And she is on the point of collapse. So when are your buses leaving? Because mine has just left. So that's how we started.
Thank you. That makes me so this is just you, right? But it went from you to 300, right? How do you start convincing people to help?
Well, it actually went from me to me plus, so at the start, I had left McKinsey, so I didn't have thousands of people working for me or with me anymore, and I had a very small local network, but I did have a very large family. So the first thing that I did was I enlisted all the kids. And so actually, our oldest literally wrote the guide for the French host families. Our second helped us think about the psychological support we could provide. Our third literally developed the website in a weekend from scratch. I went to go pick her up. I was talking to the Ukrainian consul, and I went to the bus station or the train station to pick her up. And I'm on the phone with the Ukrainian consul, and I say to him, we need a website. Emily jumps into the car, and I look at Emily, and I'm like, my daughter, Emily, she'll build us a website. Emily, meanwhile, is rolling her eyes, going, what on earth has my mother volunteered me for again? And so on the drive home, I explained to her, I'm like, sweetheart, this is what we're going to do, and we need a website because we have to convince the Ukrainians that it's okay to get on that bus because there's some human trafficking rings, there's lots of, rumors and so on and so forth. And so we need a website. And so she looks at me and she's like, yep, I'll do it. And so she literally sat down. And I brought her food, and I brought her caffeine, and I would take away the food, and take away the caffeine. And she literally did nothing else for 48 hours. I think she slept a few hours, but not much. I felt kind of guilty about this. And by the time she went to go back to school, she was 19 at the time, we had a website, and it worked on the computer and on the phone. My fourth daughter gave speeches to all the local rallies, all the local churches. She printed out these little forms on our printer and would not let people leave until they'd filled out, I'll give a can of food, I'll give a blanket, I'll give a bed, I'll give whatever they could give. Meanwhile, the younger ones, they learned how to speak Ukrainian on Duolingo, which actually turned out to be extremely useful. So we went from me to the family, and then we went to the broader community. And actually, one of the things that was amazing was to see the mobilization, was to see the solidarity, and the fact that people from all across, and we live in a village that isn't very wealthy, and people just started pouring in with donations and gifts.
So I like how in that growth, your first volunteers were possibly volunteered.
They were
and then they endorsed, right? I mean, I have children. I know what eye rolls look like before they get fully on board. But how did people, was it through the churches? Like, how did people just start coming to your door? Was it?
So basically we had, there were a couple of rallies, we had a Facebook page, we had a couple of newspaper articles, and literally from the time that word got out that we wanted to do something, we have a big farm and there are lots of barns, like literally for over a year we had one barn that was just full of vegetables and fruit and food, and one barn that was full of clothing, and one barn that was full of baby equipment, and one barn that was full of toys. And then later, as we started to move people into homes, we started collecting furniture. Then I had like 6 barns full of furniture. So Yeah, it was quite remarkable. Like literally the spontaneous desire to help, and we provided a channel where it was easy for them to just come and drop things off. It was open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Anybody come with whatever they wanted to give or whatever they wanted to volunteer and do.
So people really do want to help. It's just facilitating making it possible.
Most people wanted to help. There were a few exceptions.
I know, well, I'll talk about them. I'll talk about them in a second. And so Jack, given your experience when this first happened and the identity shift or the identity activation, how do you go from that to I'm going to swim the channel?
It's a good question. It took me quite a while. I think I took the opposite approach to Mary. I thought immediately, what is my end goal? Right? And for me, that was help Ukraine, save my heritage. Great. Where do you go from there? So I started thinking, do I fly to Ukraine? Do I drive over materials? Do I lobby policy? Right? None of those things felt really tangible to me in the moment. So I thought, okay, take a step back and think about myself. What do I know? What are my resources? What are my skills? What's my platform for why I'm going to be able to enact a change? And for me, that was always swimming. So I thought, okay, I feel very comfortable with the idea of swimming and anything in that universe. How can I pair this very known item to me to such an obscure item, which is, right, safe, my small bit of Ukrainian heritage? So connecting the two dots there took me some time, but essentially I was like, okay, I'm going to swim. I know it revolves around that. I think I can raise some money. What is an act of swimming that people would be, right, fascinated by? I asked a few, friends, a lot of research, and all signs for us pointed to the English Channel, right? For us, that is the Everest of swimming, right? You've got a lower success rate, a higher mortality rate. I was like, okay, this is it.
Is that motivating, the mortality rate? Is it motivating?
It wasn't motivating, but it was validating for us in the sense of, okay, this is our highest level of exposure that we could get to on our platform. Like, in my realm of swimming, this is the most powerful thing I could do. So that is how we ended up swimming, or I ended up with, okay, I'm gonna swim the channel. And then my next few thoughts were, okay, is this possible? Right? I was in San Francisco at the time, so I started researching what it looks like, the permits, the healthcare, the safety, the doctors, the legislation, everything under the sun. And it's like, this is a pretty big task. So who could I use to help me? And I was very fortunate. For a long period of my life, I was a very elite swimmer. And when I look at my own personal network, most of those folks are your world record holders, your Olympians. So I said, okay, I have these people at my resource. Let's get them involved. So called 5 friends. All 5 said yes immediately. And that was our initial team of swimmers. And for us, what got them motivated to join was, candidly, some wanted the challenge. Candidly, some wanted to be a part of this with me, and other people felt very connected to the crisis in Ukraine. So I was more in the boat of, whatever gets you on board with me, I'm fine with, as long as we've got aligned incentives and we know where we're going. That was kind of the formation of the initial team.
Yeah, so I like the idea of multiple motivations, right? People don't need to be motivated necessarily by the same things that you are, right? I imagine that some of the volunteers in your network might have been motivated by the community that it built for them.
Yeah, yeah. The why has to be incredibly compelling, but there can be different whys. So if I think about the volunteers who came forward, we had some who had connections to Ukraine, right? They had family or friends, or they had done exchange programs like Children in Chernobyl. There were some where they were mothers. That was kind of where I was, and I could see the mothers with their children. And as a mother, I immediately empathized with what they were going through. The other thing that was very powerful in France was the memory of parents and grandparents who themselves had been refugees fleeing south in front of the Nazi armies with bombs crashing around them. And those memories live on, and they really, really run deep. And then for some, it was about community and friendship. And for others, it was about purpose and meaning and something bigger than themselves. And one of these really surprised me were the number of emails that I received from French volunteers who were thanking me for having given them something that was meaningful. Right? I mean, they went to huge amounts of work and trouble and expense and expertise, and like you name it. And they were thanking me for having helped them refine their purpose.
Now you can talk about obstacles.
To talk about obstacles, yes. So interestingly, leading without formal authority, I found that the biggest obstacles were leaders with formal authority who weren't actually doing their jobs. And there were two kinds of dynamics, right? There were the leaders who couldn't, and then there were the leaders who wouldn't. And the first were actually relatively straightforward. So I'll just share two stories as examples and then what we did. So after I got like the famous email exchanges with the woman in the town hall, the next email I received was actually a summons. So I was being summoned to a meeting with all the local mayors and the sous-préfet, and they were basically convinced that I was either crazy or incompetent or both. And I remember like getting all dressed up, taking copies of my book, going in, loaded for bear. And I walk into this meeting with all these government officials, most of whom I did not know, and the room temperature just drops by about 50 degrees, and I'm like, oh, this is gonna be fun. And this is the very, very beginning of March. And so the sous-préfet opens the meeting and asks all the mayors to, share their perspectives and so on. And I'm sitting there and I'm just thinking about a million things that I have to do. And I'm not joking, they literally spend 45 minutes. I'm looking at my watch, 45 minutes with all the mayors, one after another, congratulating each other on having taken the bold and courageous and innovative initiative of having called the meeting. Literally, nobody had done anything else. They just called the meeting in which they were there mutually congratulating one another. And I'm kind of going, wait a second, there's like so much to be done. Anyway, finally, after 45 minutes, the sous-préfet asks if anyone else has anything to say. So I, of course, launch in. And I'm 2 minutes into my spiel about the amazing solidarity and mobilization in this community and how we had taken leadership positions on other key events and blah, blah, blah. When one of the mayors interrupts me, he receives a text. And he says, there's a family of 14 arriving. They don't want to be separated. Where do we go? Where do we put them? And there's complete silence in the room. Like you could have heard a pin drop. And I, of course, let the silence hang deliberately. And then after about a minute, I say, well, I'll take them. And everybody turns and looks at me and says, you can take all 14? I'm like, yeah, sure, I can take all 14. I'm like, well, how long is it going to take you to get ready for all these people? And I said, give me 10 minutes. The kitchen's stocked, the beds are made. I need to turn the heating on, but where do I pick them up? And they're like, well, how are you going to communicate with them? And I said, well, I've ordered 100 Ukrainian and French dictionaries, and I've identified 4 people who speak Ukrainian, 2 who speak Russian, and 2 who speak Polish. It's not that far from Ukrainian. It'll be fine, and Google Translate works pretty well. We'll manage it. And they're like, well, there are lots of children. There are 11 children coming. What are you going to do with the children? I'm like, well, as it happens, I have a lot of children too, and I've already talked to the primary school teacher. He'll take all the primary school students, give them free meals, and everyone's set up. It's ready to go. I have to do the school run anyway, so that's no problem. Same with the secondary school. I'm like, well, what about their medical issues? And I'm like, oh, I've talked to the village doctor. He's fine. And so is the pharmacist and the local nurse. Anyway, they go through a list of about 10 more questions, to which I did have answers, not perfect answers, but good enough answers to get started. At which point they realized they weren't going to shut me down. And so that was an example where they didn't have the skill. And it's not meant to be a criticism because this was a completely unprecedented, unknown situation they'd never dealt with before, right? So we were all kind of problem solving on the fly. So that was easier, right? And the sous-préfet ended up being a friend, and the mayors ended up doing all sorts of wonderful things. And so that created a really great collaboration. The bigger challenge I found were the ones who had formal authority but didn't want to do their job. And my biggest challenge was the housing agency. And so initially, we put all these people in French host families, right? And they were amazing. But I knew it wasn't going to last forever because I don't know if you've had the experience of welcoming in complete strangers that you can't communicate with and sharing a bathroom and a kitchen where you have very different cultures, and some people are deeply traumatized and so on and so forth, but it's not easy. And they did an amazing job, but I knew it wasn't going to last forever. So from the very beginning, I kept saying, look, we are the emergency solution, but this is temporary. We need to prepare for social housing. We need to prepare for where they go next. And I've been saying that right from the start. And I'd had a few interactions with the lady who's in charge of the housing in which we perhaps had not gotten on to the right foot because we had a rather tense exchange at one point in which she was quizzing me on what I had done and I explained, and then I asked her what she had done, and she said that she was in the process of assessing the respectability of all these French owners who had put properties onto her platform. I said, okay, well, that's great. How many have you done? And she said 100. And I said, and how many Ukrainians are currently living in those 100 houses? To which the answer was 0. At which point I asked her whether this was a purely theoretical exercise or whether she was actually planning on helping somebody at any point. Anyway, so that was kind of where we'd started. But nevertheless, it had kind of deteriorated from there, and she just basically wasn't doing her job. And so this was now June, and I knew that if I didn't get things sorted for July, nothing happens in August in France, especially anything related to the government. It was going to be dead. And so that meant that by September, people wouldn't be in their new homes, the kids wouldn't know which school that they should sign up for, and then it would create even more disruption to some people who desperately needed stability and a bit of just constancy. So I decided, okay, in June I'm gonna make a huge push because I need this for July, because otherwise we can't move them in August and they won't be in the right house for September. So I'm a reasonably persistent person, so I was sending like 1 email a day, and I moved to 2 emails a day, and then 3 emails a day, and I was copying everybody on these emails to the housing agency, basically saying, like, when's your housing gonna come up? And I had told them, look, we'll take anything, right? If it's dirty, we'll clean it. If it needs repairing, we'll repair it. If it needs painting, we'll paint it. If it's empty, we'll furnish it. Like, we will do the work, just give us the housing. Anyway, I finally got up to 5 emails a day when the head of the housing agency made the mistake of reply to all, in which she told me that she was far too busy to respond to my emails and my voicemails, at which point I lost it. And so I called up the most senior government official, and I said, you know and I know that I'm in touch with every local, regional, and national newspaper, radio, and television station. We've been on the front page of the Figaro. We've been the feature segment of the France 2 national news. I can give you hundreds of articles about what we've done. If this isn't sorted out in the next 48 hours, I'm throwing a press conference. The title of the press conference is Hypocrisy and Incompetence of the French Administration in the Face of the Human Tragedy of Ukraine. And I will release a 50-page dossier with every error, every mistake, every incompetence, every delay, and every excuse with radical transparency. You've got 48 hours. It's your call. Within 24 hours, I had all the housing I needed.
I wonder now what kind of obstacles you might have had to overcome.
Jellyfish, hypothermia.
That is a tough one to follow. Obviously, when we speak about the concept of obstacles, for me, I know this is going to sound really bizarre, but the obstacles for us necessarily weren't on the swimming side. For us, it was fundraising, right? Because Mary was so gracious to introduce us to a lot of people in the UK that we would go and we would pitch to for corporate sponsorships. And a lot of our pitch was, hey, listen, I'm Jack. These are our teams of Olympians. This is what we're doing, blah, blah, blah. And it wasn't really resonating with people at first, right? We weren't really getting any traction. We thought, what are we missing? How can we raise money? How can we make this get through to people? And we thought, instead of talking about what we are doing, let's reframe this so that we can show the businesses what we would give them back. So we were like, okay, instead of us, hey, look at us, we're swimmers, it was, hey, listen, you now have a 503c1 deductible tax benefit. We know you have Ukrainian employees. This is your ability to give back to them. So it was more framing it in the business's mind than more as a swimmer. So for us, it was really changing the incentives for them to get involved with us. And once we painted that in their eyes, I think the reaction was much different. I mean, another big hurdle was you never want to attach yourself to something that's not going to be successful. And when part of your pitch is, hey, listen, the fatality rate is higher than Everest, that doesn't sound super successful. So we had a lot of people push back just on the premise.
That was part of your pitch.
It was at first. So for us, that was a big, hurdle to move through. And obviously in a 30-minute meeting with someone, you can't really convey, hey, listen, I'm going to put my life on the line. I need you to trust me, right? You're not going to get that in 30 minutes. Some people did understand, others didn't. All we would do is just move on and keep, I guess, moving forward, reaching out to more folks and going back for more sponsorship. But eventually kind of the shifting of priorities for us really allowed people to get on board a lot quicker.
Well, perspective. I mean, I don't know if it's priority so much as you were taking their perspective.
Exactly, yeah. We just thought how it would be more impactful for them to hear. And that's how we kind of changed our initial pitch.
And there weren't any physical obstacles to overcome.
I mean, there were a huge amount of physical obstacles, right? I mean, swimming the channel is not a walk in the park. But for me, that was why we chose it. It was an area that we, as a team, felt tremendously comfortable with. So for us with swimming, we could be proactive. We knew how to train. We knew how to get ready for cold acclimation. We knew the mental stress it was going to put us. We thought we knew the mental stress it was going to put us under. But it was kind of an arena that was familiar to us. What was unfamiliar and what we had to be reactive with was legal teams, sponsorships, media, setting up foundations. That was more of the challenge.
And so if you ever became overwhelmed or disheartened, right, how would you pick yourself up again?
think on a fundraising side, just knowing that we had already achieved more than we set out to do, so reaching out to people to try and get more funds wasn't the end of the world, right? All they're going to do is say, no, we've already raised, X amount of money, let's just keep seeing what we can do. I think from a physical standpoint, right, because we were so the channel usually is around 12 degrees Celsius. Your body goes into hypothermic shock anywhere underneath 20 degrees Celsius. So for us, it really, we had to meet with full medical teams to get psych evaluations so that they would approve us to be like, okay, you guys are mentally sane to do this, right? It's not a suicide mission, you're capable of it. And so for us, that meant in January, swimming in the Thames, right? It was the coldest body of water that we could get into. And it's without a wetsuit, right? Which we thought was a joke at first. So you're right, we're in a Speedo, goggles, cap. It is maybe 6 degrees Celsius in the water, and we just have to keep putting ourselves back into it. I think for us, we really reevaluated, am I capable physically of doing this? And it was more of a passing thought. I feel like for us, we had met Mary, we had been to her foundation, we had met the Ukrainian women and children. We knew what we were up against, and we knew that any obstacle that we approached was minute in comparison to the stories of Ukrainian women and children that we were hearing. So for us, it was like our suffering was minimal in comparison, and I think that it put it into perspective for us.
Yeah, well, perspective taking.
Yeah. It was the worst day of my life at the swimming channel, I will not lie.
Everyone's got to have one, though.
Yeah, it was that miserable.
I mean, because this is about generations, right, and how people from different generations might approach things similarly or differently. I mean, clearly, you had different approaches in some ways, the content of the task. But what are the other similarities or differences you see in your approaches and perspectives?
So I think if Mary tells you there were a lot of similarities, she's definitely lying, because I modeled all of my approach off of Mary, right? Mary made me question how many hours are in the day. Every time I would get an idea, Mary would be 10 steps ahead, looking at 50 other things, and I'd be like, okay. So for me, honestly, my leadership style just became, if Mary was directional, I would put in the legwork in whatever direction that meant, right? Because I had a lot of questions, right? I didn't know how to fundraise to corporate businesses. I didn't know how to set up foundations. All I knew was swimming. I knew that if I could control that, if I get pointed in a direction, I can run after it. So for me, I think that was really, really permanent, was understanding the direction and putting the legwork behind it. Almost like you can lead a horse to water, but it can't drink. We were drinking anything that people would put in front of us. So I think it was just brute force, honestly, for quite a while, and having full confidence in our domain, which was the swimming.
So I'm going to disagree with him, because I actually think there were a lot of similarities between what each of us did, and I think Jack is incredibly humble. But I think there were kind of 5 big things that both of us did in our different ways, and then there's some really big differences, which I'll come on to in a second. The first one was we had a vision, and we coupled that with action, right? So we had a really clear why, what we wanted to do, why it mattered, why it made a difference, but it was also practical, right? And so there was a vision and action. The second was role modeling, right? You did that hard work. You went into the hypothermia and the Thames at 5 degrees centigrade, and I did the same, right? I never asked anyone to do anything I wasn't already doing. So the role modeling was super important. We each built a great team. I mean, you had an amazing team of Olympic athletes and world record holders, and I had an amazing team too. So we built a great team. We had to be agile because you didn't know when you were going to go. You had to pack the training in. We were learning stuff all the time. Certainly, we had to be constantly learning and agile. And we had to be incredibly persistent, right? We just had to keep pushing no matter how hard it was. So I actually think there were a lot of similarities between what we did. There were a few major differences, other than the fact that he's an incredible athlete and I am so not. But the other major difference, and I think this may be one of the generational aspects, is Jack did a brilliant job on the social media. I was pretty good at traditional media. Initially, I didn't want any media, but then I realized media was power and it was influence, and it was the only lever I had to make some of the agencies and officials move. So I was pretty good at traditional media, but honestly, we could have done so much better on the social media.
Do you want to reconsider any of your answer, Jack?
I think on the social front, something really positive that happened was a lot of people came on organically, surprisingly. So we actually had, through a friend of a friend, a professional videographer and photographer who came on board. And they were like, hey, listen, we really like what you're doing. We'd love to film it. And for us, it became mutually beneficial because it gave them content to film, and it gave us exposure, right? And from what I had seen in a fundraising perspective, right, exposure was king. The more people who heard about us, saw quality content, understood the image, understood the mission, the more people who were getting involved. So I think for us, we understood social was a big lever to pull quite early.
So the last question I'll ask before I move on to questions from the audience is, what advice would you give anyone here who has an ambition to take on an audacious and slightly potentially irrationally large goal?
I'll kick us off because I feel like Mary's will outweigh mine very significantly. But my biggest thing is to start with something you know, right? Especially when you want to be a leader and you want to incite change. That's obviously a very, very fluid subject to begin, right? Where do I start? For me, it was starting with something that was very comfortable. I knew that I could control, and then I could build things out around it. Right? Maybe I was trying to think of a professional example in a sense. Maybe if you want to make a change through your business, right? Let's say you're really familiar with your CRM. Start there, go through deal generation, and then move outwards, right? Start with something you are really familiar with, and then go from there. I think the second piece is make sure that along the way, all of the incentives are aligned, right? So we had to understand, almost be a chameleon in a sense, but not in an inorganic way that we were saying things that weren't true for us, but more letting people know the incentives that they had to be involved with what we were doing. Because they didn't need to, they didn't have to. We wanted to present it as an opportunity for them, which made it a lot easier to get support.
Thank you.
So, I mean, I would argue that a lot of the things that we do, there's no silver bullet, right? We would say in Texas, there's silver buckshot. There's lots of things you have to do in order to really make this.
Is that really a saying in Texas?
It is a saying in Texas, along with loaded for bear. Yep. Anyway, and damn straight, and lots of others. So I think there's lots of things you have to do, and we talked about some of them. So vision and action, role modeling, building a great team, learning agility, and so on, and persistence. But I would double click on the role modeling, because when you don't have formal authority, it is even more important to lead from the front with your actions, not just your words, with what you do and how you lead. And that's really tough. The first 3 to 4 months, I was working 18 to 20-hour days every day, 7 days a week, and that was really tough. So I would say make sure you put your own oxygen mask on. Don't hesitate to ask for help. Celia and Marina, who's here somewhere,
Thank you for pointing out Marina.
Actually came at one point, because at the start, like, we had done some really cool stuff, like really cutting edge, and we had created lots of answers, because at the beginning it was radical uncertainty. We had no answers to even the most basic questions. And thanks to a great team and lots of trial and error and experimentation and so on, we actually ended up having lots of answers to lots of questions. But I was so exhausted, I simply didn't have any capacity to actually pull this together and then feed it back to the Ukrainian consul or to the Ukrainian embassy or to any of the government officials. And so Celia and Marina came out, and at a time when I was like exhausted beyond belief, I just kind of shared what we had done. I said, please help, because I know there's gold dust in here. I know this can help so many more people than just the people that we have here, but I just can't do it. And thankfully, Celia and Marina did an amazing job, like literally codified this playbook, which we then shared back and became like, here's the standard playbook of how you do this across France. And so it ended up helping like literally tens of thousands of people. And I simply couldn't have done it. But thanks to Celia and Marina, we were able to really have an impact at a much, much bigger scale. And I think that's an amazing thing about Imperial, right? And the fact that Jack and his team did like the amazing thing that they did, again, impacted a much, much bigger scale. So I would say, don't be afraid to ask for help. Make sure you put your own oxygen mask on first. And remember that people will be watching you. So it's really important that you do lead from the front, and people will watch your feet, not just your lips.
Definitely. Well, thank you for that, and thank you, Marina, wherever you are. My glasses are off, so. We would like to turn it over to you. This room is full of so many current and former students I've had and people I know through Imperial, which is the most incredible network that we are trying to learn to leverage better. And I know that lots of you will have questions for this amazing panel. So there's Juliana, and there's a question. It's wired.
Hello. Hi, I'm Fleck. I was on the MBA with Jack last year, actually, and I've had the privilege, thank you so much for telling your stories again, but of seeing Mary at the our Welcome Day in 2022, and obviously have kind of being there for some of Jack's story along the way. I had goosebumps, and I hope I'm not speaking for just myself hearing those stories again. And I'd just love to know, what's next? Like, where do you go from there as a leader? You've had this amazing success, you're here telling us these incredibly inspiring stories. Like, what does the next step look like for both of you?
So it's still not finished. My objective was to help the people who came on that bus to become independent and autonomous, whether that meant ultimately going back to part of Ukraine that was safe, or whether that meant being independent and autonomous in France. And we're getting pretty close. So now almost all the adults are either in full-time jobs or in training programs that will get them full-time jobs. The kids are doing amazingly well. So we have this one little girl who did not speak a word of French 18 months ago. She is top of her class in every single subject, including French, and is composing poetry in French. It's amazing, right? But we're not quite done. But the bigger thing that we are now involved in is actually sending convoys of humanitarian supplies into Ukraine. And what we're seeing is that many of the fathers and sons and brothers and husbands are being deployed to the front line. We have one family where we've got the parents, the wife, and the 2 daughters. And this man is in his early 40s. He doesn't have any military experience whatsoever. He's been drafted onto the front line, and the Ukrainian army can't give him socks, boots in his size, a helmet in his size, a bulletproof jacket, a tourniquet, a first aid kit. So my husband actually leaves on the 8th to take another convoy of supplies in to try to help.
I looked it up. It's been 996 days since the first bus arrived at Mary's house. I don't want to go to 4 digits.
For me, obviously, there are no more athletic feats on the horizon. at least not right now. But how I've stayed involved is our family has helped female Ukrainian go to King's College through scholarships, and then I help Ukrainian entrepreneurs through a nonprofit in Soho expand their business into the UK. And a lot of those have to do with medical devices in and out of Ukraine.
Hi, I'm Chen. I'm an MBA like 2022. Very inspiring stories. I have a question for Mary actually, because like you mentioned, like let's say local people have different positions on the refugees. Some like you mentioned. So how do you deal with that? I expect maybe there are some conflicts and maybe some extreme words or actions. How do you solve that kind of things with the local community? Thank you.
It's a great question. To be honest, in our local village, in our local community, if there were people who didn't agree with helping the Ukrainians, they didn't have the courage to come and tell me that. I think maybe they were just a little bit afraid. But to be honest, I actually didn't feel very much of that at all. In fact, what surprised me was the level of mobilization and solidarity from across. So I live in a little village that has 1,100 people total. And at one point, the mayor asked if he could come with some sort of delegation. I said, of course, sure, no problem. And so I had actually taken a flip chart and I started writing the names of all the people in the village who had helped, between the host families and the doctor and the nurse and the school and so on and so forth. I got to 120 names. Right? The old people who'd come with the Ukrainians to plant my back garden so there would be fresh vegetables during the winter. I mean, it was amazing. The people who would come with donations, who had helped, kind of create, figure out and just sort out the mess that was sometimes my barns. I mean, it was just incredible to see that. And it was sometimes little things, sometimes big things, but everything counted. So I remember in the beginning of March, my neighbor, he sent me an SMS and he said, Mary, my house isn't very big, so I can't take in a family, but I have cows. I'll bring you milk. And for months, he came by with fresh milk, which was incredibly helpful because at one point I had 29 Ukrainians in my farm, and out of the 29, there were only 4 adults. Everyone else was a kid, so I really needed the milk. So actually, what surprised me was just how generous people were and that level of mobilization and solidarity that came through. The other thing that surprised me also was just how much you could do with the circular economy. So just to give a few examples, when we started, obviously most of these people had come on the bus, so they didn't have a car. And so we actually went to ask people for donations, and so we got quite a few bikes, which was great, but very quickly we'd given those out. And so what we then did was we went to the local dump, and we would take all the old bikes that had been taken to the dump, and we had a team that would come in and repair the bikes. And so we literally gave out like hundreds and hundreds of bikes, because with 2 bikes that didn't work from the dump, we could make one that did for free, right? A similar thing with furniture. All of the housing we got was empty. And people needed furniture. And so we basically just sent out a note to, on the network saying, we really need furniture. So if you know someone who's had a death in the family, or someone who's moving house, or who's, got a relative who's going into a nursing home and they have extra furniture, we've got teams ready to go. We'll go in, we'll pick all the furniture up, we take it back to the farm. The Ukrainians put Post-it notes on the stuff they like, and as soon as they have a house, we move it in. We literally spent nothing on furniture, right? Nothing on furniture. And we housed over 250 people just in Saint-Omer. Okay, we might have paid a little bit on one shower and on a toilet, but I think total we spent about 6,000 euros total for 250 people, completely furnished with the new fridge and the washing machine, etc. It was amazing what you could do with the circular economy. And to me, that was one of the other amazing surprises. If people are generous and a bit creative and willing to put a little bit of elbow grease in it, it's amazing what you can achieve.
We had 2 more questions come through.
Oh,
You wanted to ask one?
I hope I can articulate this as well as you guys have been doing it so far. You've gone ahead with such a noble cause, and I'm sure on the first day it must have seemed incredibly large and impossible. So when you try to achieve something this large and you assemble a team that are trying to do the same, how do you keep yourself motivated? And if you are, how do you keep your team motivated? Because I'm sure there must be dark days, there must be days when your team members are on the verge of quitting, there must be days where you are on the verge of quitting. So what do you do to get yourself up again and your fellow members up again?
Yeah. So, especially at the beginning, it was incredibly intense, and there were a few things that really helped. So, one of the first families who arrived, they had 11 children, and out of the 11 children, a lot of foster kids and an adopted child and so on. And one of them was 17 years old, and he played the piano beautifully. And he would come in and he would just play the piano. And he'd never taken a piano class in his entire life, but he just played the piano beautifully. And there were a bunch of times when I was just completely exhausted, just beyond exhaustion. And I would literally just sit on the floor in the entrance and just listen to him play the piano. And then after about 5 minutes, I'd get up and I'd go back again. Sometimes it was just about seeing a little girl who was obviously pretty traumatized. We had one little girl living in our farm who she woke up screaming every night for the first 3 months. And every time she saw a plane in the sky, she thought it was a Russian jet coming to kill her. And I remember the first smile. I gave her a bunny to pet. And I remember the first smile. And then a little bit later, I remember the first laugh. And so sometimes it was about those little things, which don't seem like a huge deal, but they were wonderful. There was this other little girl who arrived, and she left in a convoy of 12 cars, and out of the 12, only 5 made it out alive. So she literally saw friends and family in front of her, behind her, to the side, get blown up. And when she arrived, we tried to give her toys. We tried to give her, things that we thought she'd like. And she kept saying, no, I don't need anything. I don't need anything. Anyway, finally, we managed to convince her to take a jump rope, right? And on Google Translate, she wrote to us, and what she wrote was, "Thank you for bringing us happiness." So sometimes those little things made a huge difference, and it made you realize that, okay, this world may be a complete mess, but actually, at least I brought a little bit of happiness to that one little girl.
I think for us, when things got tough, we really had to dial it back to the first day and make sure that the foundations were there, right? The core group of 5 swimmers, we all firmly believed in what we were doing for Ukraine. So I think whenever things got difficult, honestly, whether it was through training, because there were some days, 5 a.m. in the Thames, where that's just about the worst place, second worst place you could be in the world. I think for us, taking a step back and realizing this is why we're doing it, this is why we're here, keep moving forward in that way. And honestly, put in the legwork yourself, right? There were some days where I just showed up to the pool by myself, or the Thames by myself, and I did that once. It never happened again, right? If you're not willing to do it yourself, no one else is going to go with you in that space. So I think making sure that the initial structure of why you're doing it is solid and known to everyone involved. Because we did have an incident where it got pretty rocky, where there were 5 swimmers, and one of us, or rather one of them, a Scottish guy throughout the process, about a few weeks in was like, you know what, I'm really seeing the traction we're having with Ukraine. I kind of want to maybe branch off and do some fundraising for cancer research. And so for me, that's fantastic, right? Who am I to tell you what you can and can't do? So I was like, of course, 100% do whatever is meaningful for you. And then a few months later, when Ukraine had a huge amount of traction and cancer research didn't, it bred a lot of animosity in the team. And I think for us, that showed that if kind of your incentives start getting misaligned, gaps grow quite quickly. So I think making sure that everyone is on the same page from the first day really helps you deal with the difficult situations.
Hi there. My name's Jacqueline, and I went to Imperial with Jack. So one of my questions for you is, you learned a lot throughout your professional career. How do you think that applied in these non-professional endeavors in terms of what were the skills that were transferable aside from just having to be highly, highly organized, just because these are, incredible orchestration. Yeah, I'd love to hear more.
So I would have to say honestly that all of my McKinsey experience was unbelievably useful, right? Around creating a strategy, around storytelling, around learning how to motivate people, how to build a team. I mean, agile way of working. So at one point in my dining room, I literally had agile doors. I had Post-it notes with all the things that we needed to do. And I was using the agile process, and we'd have stand-up meetings, and it's like, okay, who's here? And every time my children would arrive, from university with their friends, they would get looped in. It's like, okay, well, you're available and you know how to drive. Can you take so-and-so to the dentist or to the doctor or whatever? So that was hugely useful. All the skills that I had built up around, how to motivate and build a team and achieve a goal and create a strategy and orchestrate a complex transformation program and all the rest of it. The other thing that was really helpful was my network, right? So one of the things that we wanted to do at the very beginning was to actually provide both medical care, but also psychological support to many people who, frankly, were deeply traumatized. And that simply didn't exist in France. The medical support we had, that was pretty straightforward. But the psychological support had to be in Ukrainian or Russian, because many of them were Russian speaking from the eastern side of the country. And so fortunately, completely by luck, I was actually giving a speech at City in London just before the first wave arrived. And I talked a little bit about what we were trying to do for the Ukrainians. And at the end of the speech, this beautiful woman comes up to me in tears and says, I'm Ukrainian and I'm a psychologist and my mother's a psychologist and we want to help. And I'm like, oh my God, this is incredible, right? And so they created this network, Psychologists of the World for Ukraine, of 60 or 70 fluent Ukrainian and Russian psychologists who were prepared to help for free the people who were arriving, which was amazing. But we needed computers, because without computers, they couldn't connect by Zoom, and not everyone had a computer, and so on and so forth. So fortunately, I sit on the board of a number of companies, including Beamer, which is an HR tech company. And so I remember going back from London with suitcases full of computers that they had given me. And then I sent out a couple of notes to friends who are CHROs, so the CHRO of Hermes. And she's like, yeah, sure, no problem. I'll send you. How many do you need? I'm like, as many as you got. She's like, 143, okay? I'm like, yeah, that'd be just fine. She's like, would you like clothes? I'm like, yes, scarves would be great too. But anyway. So the network also really helped. Both helped.
And that's actually going to be the topic of our second Generations event, which will be in February. The date is just getting settled now. So, that's a really nice segue. I think we have time for one more question before, and I'm leaving it to Juliana to determine who that last question will be. Thank you.
That's Adriana here from One Liver UK. Thanks for being here today, Mary and Jack. Very inspiring story, and you're the heroes. Thank you very much for your help. And my question is basically, two questions. One, how do you deal with conflicts and this geopolitical chaos, let's say? And if there's one skill that you believe that every leader should have, what would that be? Thank you.
Wow, that's a really tough question. The first thing, though, I would say is I actually don't think that I am the hero. I actually think the Ukrainian women and children are the heroes, because the level of courage and resilience that I have seen has just been truly extraordinary. Over this last year and a half, I have had so many times when I've ended up with buckets of tears and, kind of these emotional upheavals and so on. I haven't seen a single Ukrainian adult cry, right? The level of courage and resilience that they have demonstrated in the face of unbelievable odds has just been truly extraordinary. So I would say they're the real heroes. That would be the first thing. I'm now going to pass it to you while I think about the answer to the second part of your question.
I mean, I think I almost get a little bit emotional because as soon as you asked the question, my head immediately went to what Mary just said, right? I never saw us as the heroes. For me, it was always the Ukrainian women and children were really going through the hard times. For me, it was just right. Swimming's up my alley. I'm comfortable with it. It was easy for me. So it was always strange getting a lot of attention for it. I felt like it should have been put elsewhere.
All right, now I'm going to have a crack at the second part of your question. So one of my favorite definitions of leadership is the art of inspiring others to achieve greatness. So if I had to pick one thing, I would say inspiration. In a good cause, because, you know, sometimes they're...
On that note, can I just add, we have a great team of software engineers and architects. If you need software, thank you very much. On that note, can I just add, we are a company, we're a software company. So we have a great team of engineers and software architects. In case of the website or any digital assets that you need, we'll be happy to connect and help out where we can.
That would be fantastic because one of the first things that happened when we launched our website was within about a week, we looked at, you know, who's looking at us. And the first country was France, the second country was Russia. And then we had, this documentary came out in Poland, which included a little bit about what we were doing. And we had 2,539 attacks within, like, literally, as soon as it was launched, the whole thing just kept crashing. And my daughter's really good, but it was tough to keep it up and running.
Play game over there, like cybersecurity.
Yeah.
We definitely can help with that, and we have some people that will be able to advise as well.
Awesome.
You see, our network has grown some more.
Yeah.
So I want to thank everyone for coming today. This has been a long time coming, and for Jack and Mary for volunteering their time and their stories. My favorite part about the leaders that I get the opportunity to elevate is that I get to choose who the models are, and choosing models that are humble and grateful and have the ability to take other people's perspective and engage in audacious goals for a social good is exactly what I want to try and inspire MBAs to do. I know that some people sometimes receive that as unlikely, but I will continue to do everything I can to try and elevate and use as models the people who I think are doing the most effective, excellent representations of how to be a truly responsible leader in the world. So I think that until, I don't know how much more wine there is out there, because I didn't think that there would be 150 people coming, but I'm really glad that you all did. And I look forward to our next conversation in February. You will be getting information about it soon.
I also just want to say a huge shout out to Celia and Marina and Jack and all the Imperial, I know Jacqueline's somewhere around here, all the Imperial people, because actually it was amazing to see how people from across the business school, across the university, like immediately said, what can I do to help? And you know, whether that was like literally swimming across the English Channel or pulling together the playbook that then helped, you know, codify everything we'd done. It was really inspiring to see that. So I just want to say a big shout out to Celia and Jack and everybody from Imperial who really did a huge amount.